All right.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, let's go ahead and get started. Really appreciate everybody being here this morning. It's exciting to see so many faces, and exciting to have several of Kevin's family visiting for the defense. So welcome to you all. Big thank you to the committee, Dr. Kathy Jahowski and JJ Apodaca for being here as well. I actually came to know Kevin through JJ. So JJ reached out and said, hey, I've got this project that would like you to be involved in with the salamander in Alabama. And I lived in Alabama for several years and worked with this species a little bit when I was there, so I was excited to do it. And he said, but the project comes with a student. And so he put me in touch with Kevin, and I was immediately impressed. Kevin has a really strong background from University of Georgia. His advisor there was my postdoc advisor. We're going to get to that. And so he got a real strong background in herpetology there, and then has worked on a couple of technician positions after he left UGA before coming here with USGS and ARC. So came in with a lot of really strong herp background. What I didn't appreciate was how much UGA football he would come with as well. But I came to really appreciate that in the fall when, so I grew up in Tennessee, and you grew up in Tennessee regardless of where you went there or not, you're a UT fan. And so Kevin called, hey, UT's playing Georgia, you want to get together and watch the game? And actually he said, can I come to your house and watch the game? And I said yes, saying like, some great bonding. What I didn't anticipate was getting barked at the whole time. Despite that, Kevin, I let him stay in the lab, is just a model graduate student. So Kevin worked hard to get a proposal together, spent all the time he needed to invest in the field collecting data. He's really diligent about that. The conditions in South Alabama are less than ideal in the middle of summer. Never complained. Put in all the work to get up to speed on data analysis, writing, and so thank you for that. Been really impressed. So impressed that I've asked him to stay on. So Kevin's got a job when he finishes up. He's gonna be working as a technician on a project in the lab. So excited to continue that collaboration. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to him and let him talk to you about salamanders and eDNA.
Thank you, Kyle.
Oh, and I should mention, to either celebrate or commiserate with Kevin at 5 o'clock, Kite Hill.
Yep. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Kyle, for that excellent introduction. He loves to tell that lie every chance he gets. I state I never barked at him. I may have barked at the TV, but never explicitly at him. And I also want to thank all of you guys for being here. It's really wonderful to see like a full room, especially those of you that traveled. And, I've really been looking forward to this moment today. I'm really excited because it means I get to do two of my favorite things, talk about salamanders. So without further ado, here is In a Hole in the Ground, There Lived a Salamander, eDNA Efficacy and Microhabitat Selection for Red Hill Salamanders. Maybe. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks. Nope. Oh, yeah. Okay. So, as we know, the southeastern United States has gone through a lot of change since colonization by white settlers. We have a great example of this right here in our own backyard, where the Keeley River was once a free-flowing system flowing across Piedmont Prairie and Oak Savannah managed by the Cherokee people, but is now an impounded reservoir surrounded by fire-suppressed woodland. One of the major sources of alteration during this time period came in the form of unsustainable industrial logging. Now, since that time period, our logging practices have gotten much better. They've become much more sustainable, but logging can still be a potential issue given the circumstances. And it's especially an issue for, and we see how it is an issue at multiple scales. So we see where, clear cutting at much broad scale, will turn a climax community into early successional habitat, or in the worst cases, it turned into agricultural or developmental land. But we also see where it alters the habitat at a much finer scale, where we see compaction of soil, potentially the removal of a duff layer. And this is particularly an issue for reptile and amphibian species due to a variety of reasons. This is including low vigility, they don't move around all that much. High site fidelity, they often have to return to the same area to reproduce. Small distribution sizes, and they're often specialist species. And so because of this, it's really important that we try to like collect data at both that broad scale and that fine scale in order to understand how these alterations impact these species. But this data collection can be really hard. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this as wildlife biologists. And we run into this ecological concept known as the Wallacean shortfall, where misdetections can provide or lead to gaps in our knowledge about distributions, our knowledge about population trends. And I think pine snakes are a really excellent example of that here. But I'm sure you guys have all seen this pine snake at this point because you're all excellent biologists. And so we often have to use a multitude of techniques in surveying in order to get the best possible picture of what's going on. Enter environmental DNA. So this is a somewhat new survey technique. This emerged into the wildlife field in the past 15, 20 years. And the concept behind it being, you know, as an organism goes throughout its life, it's constantly shedding DNA into the environment. And we as surveyors can go out and actually just collect samples from that environment, whether that be water, soil, or in some cases even air, extract the DNA from that and determine whether or not the animal is present in that area. And so because of this, you can imagine it's a lot less intrusive. So it's really good when it comes to those like, you know, imperiled species, those sensitive species. But it's also very time effective. It can be very time effective. Like it takes way less time for me to go out and collect a liter of water as it does for me to go out and actually put my hands on a turtle. And so it's really an ideal tool when it comes to those elusive species, like the hero of our talk today. But more on that later. But the downfall of eDNA is that where it's really good to determine like site occupancy, unless you have a very specific source of the DNA, you can't really use it all that well in other research means, whether that be, you know, trying to inform on species distribution modeling, like trying to predict where a species might occur, or maybe when it comes to resource selection, determining what environmental factors are really important to that species. And more broadly, like why we want this is so we can hopefully, like these models will inform us about the natural history of the population trends of the animal, which will ultimately help habitat managers manage habitat correctly and inform policy decisions in order to keep those imperiled organisms on the landscape. So with that in mind, let's go try to find an elusive salamander species. So we have here the great and diverse state of Alabama. So this is a state that, you know, despite its size, has more diversity per square kilometer than any other state in the United States. So despite that diversity, though, we're going to focus in within this black rectangle here, the Red Hills physiographic region. This is an area that is characterized with steep topography, where you have historically, you know, these sandy pine-dominated ridge tops, those longleaf savanna, and the ravines being these steep mesic ravines that are hardwood dominated. Within this Red Hills physiographic region, we're going to zoom in on this black squiggly line here. This is 3 geologic layers. Let's just zoom in real quick. And I want you to put yourself in a field vehicle, driving down a lazy 2-lane Alabama road in the heat of summer. You're passing some pretty ominous signs, maybe some unsavory wayside stations, but there's also some really great fried catfish to be had. And after you've stuffed yourself with catfish, you're driving along the Alabama River as the sun begins to set. You turn off of this paved road onto the dirt road, which drops you down into the woods. Pull up on the side of the road here, and you climb out of the vehicle into a steep mesic ravine. So where you find yourself is a forest where the community there is much more reminiscent of where we are here in the Piedmont, or maybe even in the foothills of the Appalachians. You have American beech, you have tulip poplar, several magnolia species, and in some areas you even have exposed rock faces. So despite being so close to the Gulf of Mexico, you have this like very unique system here. And it's now nighttime, you're walking across one of these steep ravines, trying your best not to slip and fall, and you begin to notice all these holes in the ground. And in these holes in the ground, you see a little face appear. And that is the face of a red hill salamander. So this is a very unique species. They weren't discovered until 1960, actually by accident, as a snail biologist was raking for snails in leaf litter. And they have a very complex life history strategy, where they inhabit and construct these complex burrow matrices within the size of these steep ravines. And they essentially revolve their whole life around these burrows. You know, they sit at the mouth of the burrows and they ambush prey at night. They reproduce within these burrows. You'd be hard-pressed to try to find a salamander outside one of these burrows. And so because, you know, you can only find them in these burrows, only in these ravines, only in those 3 geologic layers, only within the Red Hills, and because of threats due to the timber industry, which is the predominant land use in that region, they were listed on the Endangered Species Act in 1976. Now that listing prevented those very unique ravines from being logged, but you still have issues where you have these loblolly pine plantations adjacent to these ravines that go through this kind of like intensive management for timber. And you can have secondary effects with, as over time, pine begins to encroach down into the ravine, and you can also have drying of the soil at the tops of the ravines. And so this kind of like really unique like association with a hole in the ground couldn't help but remind me of Tolkien's Hobbits. And like this like going through grad school and completing a master's thesis is like it's a very difficult process. And so it really couldn't help but like I couldn't draw the comparison of like writing a thesis and destroying an evil ring of power. And this is Kyle's actually least favorite slide because he kept telling me he wanted hair put on his head there. And so because of that, I kind of developed this roadmap here where we're leaving the background of the Shire. We're going to travel to chapter 1 where we look at eDNA efficacy, cross the Misty Mountains, move on to chapter 2, fine scale resource selection, and finally end with some summary discussion on the slopes of Mount Doom. So with that, here's chapter 1, the efficacy of environmental DNAs, the efficacy of environmental DNA surveys for red hill salamanders. So going back to one of these ravines, and you're walking along, and you're seeing holes in the ground, and red hill salamanders actually make a somewhat distinctive burrow. It kind of has this classic characteristic shape of being like kind of oval in shape, very smooth, where you'd imagine a salamander just like rubbing its slimy stomach up and down this soil all day long. And so you can actually go to a site and kind of determine site occupancy just based off the presence of these very classic characteristic burrows. However, there's also a bunch of these other holes in the ground within these slopes. These are holes that are maybe a bit more or less refined. They're a bit more like rough around the edges, maybe a bit more circular, a bit larger. And you're not really sure if they're using those burrows or not. Plus, beyond this, unless you like happen to catch a salamander active, even the burrows that are very classic that you can strongly associate with the salamander species, you're not really sure how many salamanders are actually in those burrows. Now you can go out at night and you can do a nighttime survey because these salamanders are nocturnal and they're active at the mouth of these burrows at night. But nighttime surveys can be demanding. If you remember earlier, there's the rock face in one of my habitat shots. Like this is a very difficult terrain. You often have to rappel down into these sites. And so nighttime surveys can also be somewhat dangerous. But beyond this, salamanders are shy. When you hit them with light, they often retreat back into the burrow. So it can be really hard to actually know how many burrows within a slope actually have salamanders in them. And so because of this, most surveys for red hill salamanders are simple just burrow density counts. So they go out during the day and they count the number of those classic burrows, and that can kind of tell you an approximate for the number of salamanders within a site. At the same time, though, we know that eDNA works really well when it comes to elusive salamander species. A great example right here of passionate salamanders, where time and time again, eDNA is shown to outperform the more traditional surveys for this species. There's also one paper out there that looks at eDNA in terrestrial salamander systems. However, this paper is done in a lab setting, and they were able to prove that you can get salamander detection from soil based off the presence of eDNA. But there's still a lot of unknowns when it comes to this, mainly like when you took the system into a natural setting, how would you be able to detect DNA, and how long would you be able to detect DNA? So that led me to develop kind of two questions here for chapter 1. The first being, how do eDNA surveys compare to traditional surveys for red hill salamander presence within burrows? And the second question being, how recently does red hill salamander DNA need to be deposited for a positive eDNA detection? So to answer this question, I selected a site of like kind of classic red hill salamander habitat. It's had a robust population of salamanders on it. I systematically placed transects across this slope. I ran these transects, flagging burrows, and also swabbing these burrows along the way for a total of 182 burrows. Now, these burrows that I flagged, I kind of classified them into two major categories. The first being distinctly used by red hill salamanders. This is like kind of that traditional surveyed burrow. And the second being potentially used by red hill salamanders. This is like something that is typically ignored on one of those burrow density surveys. But, there's still, that burrow has characteristics to it that a salamander might be able to utilize it. I then went out within 24 hours of swabbing for eDNA and reran these same transects at night, typically the night following swabbing, to see if any of these burrows had salamanders present at the mouth of them. I also collected several covariates, including slope, which was taken at a DEM raster layer, height on the ravine, which was just a measure of where along the transect the burrow was found, with lower values indicating higher on the slope, because that was closer to the beginning of the transect, and soil moisture, which was taken at 3 kind of haphazard locations within 3 meters of every burrow and averaged down to 1 value. I then ran a series of t-tests for each of these variables to determine whether any of these covariates might have an effect on eDNA detection or not. So kind of to answer that second question, I just selected a different site that also had a robust population of red hill salamanders. And within this site, I selected 5 burrows. I identified 5 burrows for isolation. So the idea here is that if I could isolate these 5 burrows and then swab them over a period of time, I could kind of see whether or not we would see any kind of drop in detection over that time period. And these burrows were selected based off of the recent presence of red hill salamanders. I made sure that there was a salamander present there within 24 hours of isolation. Burrow stability, I want to emphasize that I made sure that the burrow was still usable after isolation and the pair of the animal was taken into mind. And then the general burrow location, I tried to keep these burrows somewhat close to each other. That way any covariates acting upon eDNA presence would be somewhat similar across these 5 burrows post-isolation. I then removed the swab site. So this was a bit of a complicated process to try to describe, but if you can imagine, you see a hole in the ground, I took a trowel and I kind of cut into the slope and took the first couple inches, the first 1.5 inches of the burrow, which was my swab site. So I essentially had a donut of soil, trying to keep the burrow intact. And you'll see here in a moment kind of the end result of that. I then took that donut of soil and placed it in with a PVC slip joint, a zip tied wire mesh on either side of the slip joint to create some kind of a pseudo burrow. I then placed these 5 pseudo burrows within 4 meters of each other on a slope on a singular transect, so that kind of the end result would look like, I'm just going to switch over to actually this. So you just kind of see the donut of the soil there inlaid, so it's flush with the ground, emulating natural conditions. And so this kind of pseudo burrow was then swabbed once prior to extraction. That way I would know whether or not DNA was even present there to begin with. Immediately after extraction and placement into this singular transect within the same site, so that I would know whether any eDNA was lost in the extraction process. And then once every other day for 14 days, and then a final time 30 days later. All of our samples were then sent to Tanglebank Conservancy in Asheville, where they performed qPCR. This was done using a species-specific primer, so that no other salamander DNA might be amplified to give us a false positive or a false positive. PCR is a somewhat complicated process, but just very briefly, you have this kind of master solution with your primer, your liquefied sample, and then what's known as a probe. It's then heated to very specific temperatures, which would cause the DNA to split, the primer and probe to attach, and then DNA to be replicated. And as it's replicated, that probe is broken off, which causes fluorescence. And so we can kind of then measure that fluorescence kind of on a curve to determine how much DNA approximately is in every sample. And so samples were run as triplicates, so every swab was broken down into 3 samples, and I determined a burrow to be positive if 2 out of those 3 samples returned back positive. So kind of our results here, out of those 182 burrows, you'll notice that 60 came back positive for eDNA. And nearly 1/3 of that was those kind of category 2, those non-traditional burrows sampled. Contrary to this, only 20 came back positive from visual surveying. However, you'll notice that out of those 20, 7 were missed by eDNA. So if we look at the burrows that we specifically knew had salamanders in them because I saw salamanders in them, that gives us a 35% false negative rate for eDNA. And so we'll get back to that in a second, but that's somewhat of an interesting result. And in addition, we also had no real effect of the environmental factors on any of my t-tests. I found no significant results for eDNA presence. Okay, so kind of the second question, the results here. So we see where we've had detection fall kind of over time. If you see across the x-axis here, days since isolation, and the y-axis is the average detection probability across all 5 of those boroughs. So it's simply like this first one with this is immediately after placing it back into that transect, all 5 of those boroughs tested positive. The next sampling period, 4 out of those 5 tested positive. And so we see where it falls over time. But we also see where if we look at the individual boroughs, detection was not consistent with that time. So I have one sampling period where I go out, did a positive sample, the next time negative, and then the time after that positive. So it was inconsistent with time. Finally, decay rates were dependent on the amount of DNA initially present in these samples, with the ones that had more DNA present holding detection for a longer period of time. So kind of what does this mean? We saw where eDNA outperformed visual detection with kind of just like that raw detection. And we also saw where about 1/3 of those positive detections came from those non-traditional boroughs. But we also had that high false negative rate. So future surveys should consider sampling a borough more than once. And I think this is even more emphasized with the degradation trials where, if I just happen to go out and sample that borough on that one day that I didn't have detection, that would determine that borough to not have any eDNA in it. But if I had sampled it over like 3 days, then yeah, 2 out of the 3 came back positive. And finally, even though it was only a very small sample size of only 5 boroughs, this is the first study, to my knowledge, done to test salamander DNA longevity in a natural environment. Okay, so moving on to chapter 2. Take a water break real quick. Local environmental drivers of red hill salamander burrow placement. So all organisms, regardless of shape or size, utilize resources across their landscape, whether that be food or shelter, in order to survive. Now, we as scientists can go out and try to empirically evaluate that resource use through the use of resource selection functions by measuring what is available to every organism as opposed to what is selected, what is preferred by that organism. And we can even run some models and actually predict a optimum amount of that resource for organism use. So as you can imagine here in this hypothetical situation, as the number of prey items increase, there becomes a certain point when a predator is like, okay, this is now a preferred area because of that X number of prey items. And this kind of resource selection, it also happens at a variety of scales, all the way from broad, landscape scale to specific kind of habitat scale, all the way down to the microhabitat scale. And it's this kind of microhabitat scale that we're going to be looking at today. And but in order to look at that, you really have to have that fine scale input data. You can't go out and measure variables at a kilometer scale if you're going to look at a species resource use at the half kilometer scale. And there is some really good work done with red hill salamanders to evaluate resource use both at that kind of broad range-wide scale, but also within a ravine scale. However, there's still some environmental factors that are mentioned anecdotally within the seminal red hill salamander literature that have not been empirically tested. And also, based off our results from our chapter 1, we see where red hill salamanders are utilizing kind of that non-traditional, non-sampled burrow. And so maybe leveraging eDNA, because we have a specific swab site, to try to inform us on resource selection could give us different results. So that led me to develop this question: what within ravine environmental factors are meaningful drivers for red hill salamander burrow placement? And so to answer this question, we went back to that same site. This is same robust population of red hill salamanders that the eDNA efficacy was done on those same transects. And this data was kind of collected concurrently along with the eDNA swabs. And it resulted in kind of 2 major data sets. And so just to try to visualize those 2 data sets here, you'll have this virtual slope with the top of the slope at the top of the slide and the bottom of the slope at the bottom of the slide. My transect, so this blue dashed line is running across it. And we have those category 1 burrows intermixed across the slope side. So this is kind of that one data set. This is kind of the traditional data set, collecting data from these category 1 burrows. However, we also know that there's a bunch of category 2 burrows interspersed across the slope as well. And even within both of these two different categories, we know that we have red hill salamander presence, either based up from those visual surveys that I did or those eDNA surveys that I did. And so kind of this like known utilization from those two surveys comprise the second data set. But, in order to understand resource selection, we have to have something to compare it to. We have to know what is available at the site to compare what the red hill salamanders are maybe preferentially preferring. So to do that, I placed systematically 243 available points every 3 meters on every transect, 1.5 meter on every either side of the transect. And at all these points, I collected a series of covariate data, including height on the ravine, which is again, that's that same measure where lower the value, the higher on the slope. Soil compaction, soil moisture, and leaf litter depth, which were all three again taken at 3 locations within 3 meters of every point and then averaged to one value. Distance to structure, so this is a straight line distance from the burrow being sampled to one of 4 structure categories: base of a tree, exposed root, exposed rock, or down coarse woody debris. Distance to closest burrow, so this is just a straight line distance from the burrow being measured or the point being measured to the next obvious burrow, whether that be on or off the transect. And finally, slope, which was again taken from that 3-meter DEM raster layer. And so the predicted relationship, my hypothesized relationship with each of these variables with red hill salamander burrow presence is shown here on the right. And then those kind of like untested variables that were taken from the literature are underlined here. So soil compaction, distance to structure, and distance to closest burrow. I then had to take all this data and center and scale it in order to compare it to each other. And I also had to check for any correlation within this data using a Pearson's correlation coefficient. And I found none there. I also tested the response variable of salamander burrow presence for spatial autocorrelation and found no real strong autocorrelation there. I then ran a series of logistic regression models, including a null model where everything was held constant, a microhabitat model, which includes soil moisture, soil compaction, and leaf litter, a burrow position model, which includes slope and the height on a ravine, a surface structure model, which includes slope, distance to structure, and structure type, a neighborhood model, which included distance to structure, distance to burrow, and soil compaction, and finally a global model that had all those environmental variables in it. Ranking these in an AIC framework, I found that the global model had, for both data sets, had the strongest support by far. And both of these models tested really well when validated using a 5-fold cross-validation. And so the results from both of these data sets using that top model are shown here with category 1 burrows right here, and then the confirmed utilized ones over here. All of the environmental variables I tested on the y-axis here. And across the x-axis, you have like coefficient estimates. So this is the effect size that each of these variables had on burrow presence, red hill salamander burrow presence. And this is a lot. So the main thing I kind of want you to take away from here is that both of these kind of distributions are very similar to each other. So there was no real strong difference between those two data sets. And if you look really closely, you'll actually notice where the category 1 burrows actually had a bit stronger of effect sizes. So they're further away from 0. The numbers are like square root or the absolute value of the numbers is higher. And because of that, and because the category 1 data set was had a much larger sample size, we're going to continue with just those category 1 burrows. So yeah, this is again those category 1 burrows. The results from that, just looking at that global model. And you also notice that the dashed lines with the open circles, so that's the 95% confidence interval. And we determine a variable to be biologically significant if that confidence interval doesn't overlap with 0. Because 0, if we have the result of 0, it just means that there's no effect of that variable on red hill salamander presence. And so looking at this, you'll notice that there are 4 variables where the confidence interval did not overlap 0. So we're going to continue with those 4 variables. So leaf litter, if we plot the relationship it had with burrow presence, we see that there was a negative relationship. So as you increase the amounts of leaf litter, you see a drop in the predicted presence of red hill salamander burrows. So This was contrary to my hypothesis, and I kind of think that there's a detection component at play here. As you'd imagine, it's much harder for me to spot a burrow that's under 10 centimeters of leaf litter as it is for me to spot a burrow that has no or leaf litter around it. Soil compaction was also a negative relationship. This supported our hypothesis where, as the soil becomes more compacted, there's less of a chance for a burrow to be placed there. Distance to structure and distance to burrow were also both negative relationships. Distance to structure supported my hypothesis with burrows more likely to be close, kind of placed close to that structure. Maybe that structure is providing a bit more stability for the burrow. And then distance to burrow was contrary to our hypothesis. So I included this burrow because I thought there might be kind of a competition component at play here, like pushing burrows to be placed or inhabited burrows to be placed like further away from each other. But this doesn't seem to be the case here. And so kind of what does this mean for this chapter? We saw where burrow placement was best explained with that global model that had all the variables. And we see this with some other very unique and picky species, especially like eastern hellbenders. And we also saw where all of those previously untested variables were significant. So soil compaction and both of the distance measures were important to red hill salamander burrow placement. We also saw that there was a little difference between the two data sets. And so this kind of tells us that there's no real warrant in trying to putting forth that extra effort to determine whether or not a salamander is actually currently using a burrow to determine resource selection. Okay, so almost done here. Moving on to the summary and discussion. So just to kind of rehash, there are still many issues facing red hill salamanders, particularly habitat fragmentation. And there's still a lot of unknowns today when it comes to the species' natural history, particularly salamander to burrow ratios. There are some papers that look at the burrow ratio stuff, but the results vary quite broadly. But we see from this study where eDNA has a potential both in this system, but also kind of terrestrial amphibian systems more broadly. However, that high false negative rate still gives us pause. And so there's still a lot of kinks to be worked out here. I'd like to see where, people develop like a certain sampling regime in order to overcome that false negative rate. We also see and also future studies should consider expanding sampling to include this kind of non-traditional burrows because we saw where like that category 2 burrows had a salamander presence in it. I also think that management actions should consider those previously untested variables across the range of the species. So we saw where they were meaningful within this site, but we're not really sure if that holds up across other sites. And if it does, sites that may appear good that have been tested kind of for maybe canopy cover or steepness of slope, like other factors important to the salamander species, that it still might be limited because soil compaction hasn't been tested there, and it's too compacted in order for that population to actually reach like what a healthy levels. More broadly, though, we see where data deficiency is a threat to biodiversity, especially when it comes to elusive species. This is a breakdown of all vertebrate taxa from the IUCN on like conservation need category, and we see where data deficient is the second largest category. We also see where addressing conservation at the large scale is not simply enough. You can have an excellent breeding wetland for gopher frogs, but unless you have that kind of fine scale microhabitat refugia surrounding that wetland, the wetland itself is going to be limited with the population size. Still, though, as technology advances, we're finding more and more efficient ways to overcome these data deficiencies. And emerging methods like eDNA can maybe streamline data collection so you don't have to be hooked up to a harness doing this all day. Also, that kind of data collection will help us broaden our knowledge of vital habitat factors that can hopefully better inform management practices, habitat practices, and logging practices. And just, to kind of see where it goes from here, I'd love to see, again, like a determination of an appropriate protocol for eDNA sampling, maybe finding the minimum number of swabs needed in order to overcome that false negative rate. I'd love to see where eDNA is used for population estimation. This is, I think, down the road a bit, but it would make our knowledge of like population trends within the species a lot easier to determine. And also, there's been some site prioritization based off habitat done at a broad scale for the species, but I'd love to see this done at a much finer scale as well. And so with that, I'd like to thank all these people. It takes a while because there's a lot of photos on it. First and foremost, Kyle. I think there's very few advisors that you could quote bark at or, dress up as for Halloween and get away with it. I really think that any prospective student, a question they should be asking themselves is is my advisor kind? And I think that's shown a lot in this department, but I think it's really exemplified in Kyle. All these people who helped me with fieldwork and logistics for fieldwork. My committee members, Kathy and JJ, you guys are both conservation icons, and I hope to impress you one day. And also my lab members, your guys' advice is always warranted and it's always so helpful. But more broadly, everybody here, coming to Clemson, I think at first there was a little bit of a hesitation because of me having gone to UGA. Actually, it seemed to have shown through with some hostility, but you guys have really made this place a home. Particularly Michael, Dorothy, Bobby, and Megan. You guys have been wonderful. Sebastian, my cat, he's honestly one of the best things that's ever happened to me, and he has no idea what I'm doing here today. And also, the people who aren't in Clemson that have helped me along the way. My parents, you guys took me to my first ever stream and had me flip my first ever rock to find my first ever salamander that led me on this path here today. All the pals, all the ethical pals, you guys are the best people I could ever hope to know. I'm so glad to have you guys as friends for life. And then honestly, more broadly, people at ARC, but more like people working in conservation across the world. This, especially right now, it's really dark in this field. It can be really depressing, but seeing all the work that everybody else is putting forth to try to make change, to make the world a better place is really inspiring. And finally, one more thing I'd like to thank Red Hill salamanders. No one ever thanks their study species. And they're such a unique salamander. It's been such a privilege to get to work with them. It'd be awesome to continue to work with them in some capacity down the line. But yeah, it's something I never thought I'd be able to work with. And so with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great talk. So when you were looking at the degradation of the samples, you were still swabbing the whole time, right? It was never like sampling from the soil directly.
Yeah, I was still swabbing that same swab site.
Okay. So I guess my main question is, do you think that it would be useful to get direct soil samples that would allow for capture of more substrate, depth into the substrate? Do you think that would have a higher efficacy than just your swabs that might miss anything that's gotten washed deeper into the soil?
Yeah, so that was definitely a method that we thought of when we were developing this project. I think the main reason why we didn't go with it is there was a concern of damaging the burrow integrity by trying to take that out. But yeah, I mean, there's also the issue of inhibition, when it comes to PCR.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that would capture more DNA than a swab.
Yeah.
Bryce.
Cool. Great talk. With your resource selection functions, you found that closer burrows or burrows that were closer to other burrows had a higher probability of occupancy, which was contrary to your original hypotheses. What are some potential mechanisms you think might be driving that?
So again, I originally had this idea that this species is sister to another group that's known to be very aggressive. So I thought that there might be some aggression driving burrows being placed further from each other. It could be that, like I said, this is a site that has a robust population of salamanders that habitat quality within the site's pretty good. So there may not be much of a need in order for them to like actually compete with each other. So that could be a reason why those burrows are placed more closely to each other. These burrow systems, again, are like a matrix of complex burrows. And so it's honestly kind of hard to determine how many entrances a matrix has. But you know, I did my best. If there were two burrows like right next to each other where I could like see they connected like an inch under the ground. I obviously only sampled one of those, but I mean, there could be also some of that muddying the waters as well. Yeah.
I have a question regarding means you were taking swabs from salamanders and from the soil, and so which tool did you use exactly to get the swabs? Means did you get it from the mouth or from how exactly for the salamanders I'm talking?
Yeah. So I mean, these were just simple swabs of the soil within like 2 inches of the burrow entrance to try to like get some of that environment, some of that DNA that like the salamander is excreting into the soil daily.
That's the difference between the DNA when you got the swabs and to determine the DNA. Did it also affect the behavior of the salamanders, or you were able to identify the behavior of the salamanders through these swabs?
No, we're not there yet when it comes. So eDNA, because it's kind of like extracellular, it's in the environment. It's much harder to try to get anything beyond, you know, presence absence. There's been some work done with sea turtles where they've actually been able to genotype the sea turtles because, you know, as a female comes up on the beach to lay eggs, the next morning everybody's like running down the beach to try to like cage those nests, but they're also getting the tracks from the female. So they can simply just sample the soil from that track. And it's like it was deposited there like within 24 hours. And they also like get a lot more money than salamander stuff. So there's been a lot of innovation there. Yeah.
Great talk. I was just wondering, with your first chapter, did you consider running more complex models like you saw in chapter 2 with those environmental variables, where you have them all together in one model as a covariate as covariates in one model?
The chapter 1 stuff, like the eDNA stuff?
Yeah. So the t-test that you ran, right? Did you consider running more complex model where they're all integrated together for prediction?
No, I did not. I did run some I think I ran some ANOVAs to see if there was any kind of difference, maybe per transect of the environmental variables. But no. Yeah, Luke.
I may have missed this, but do those salamanders like move between burrows like they're breeding? Is that a concern for detectability?
Yeah, I'm not sure we have a great idea of that because like we don't really know what's happening under the soil, right? Like again, like I'm not sure how interconnected these burrows are. It's certainly there in the literature there is where they've actually marked salamanders before with pit tags and they see it show up in a different burrow later on, so there is some movement. I'm not sure how common that is though. Yeah, Aaron.
First of all, what an impressive amount of effort and data collection you did, and I think it came through that you had really good study design and so kudos to you on that. I have a very basic question. Why are there type 2 burrows? Are they opportunistically using these holes? Are they like falling into disrepair?
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's a mix of things. I think that, you know, these type 2 holes are like rotted root chambers, maybe old rodent burrows. You see a lot of trapdoor spiders in these slopes. It's actually really cool. Like you go to the system and like almost there's a lot of organisms in the system that their like life history strategy is like dig a hole and wait at the mouth of it. Those spider holes are, for the most part, smaller than the burrows that I created, but I could also see, you know, like an old trapdoor spider looking like that as well. And yeah, I do think that they could be old, degraded category 1 burrows as well. Yeah.
When you're sampling for the available spots, when you're doing your used available stuff, did you ever find a burrow when you were like, oh, this is an available but not used space that would have turned out to be used?
Yeah, quite often, yeah. Cal.
I have 2 questions before that. Loved can't wait to enjoy tonight. My questions are sort of like extensions from David and Luke's question. So first of David, regarding the analysis, did you like for the habitat selection modeling, did you look at any sort of other permutation and combination of the variables rather than just bivariate and then bivariate model?
Between what?
Between the variables, like did you look at a dredge it or the follow selection by or anything like that?
No, I feel like data dredging is, I don't know, it's like an interesting topic to try to make things more significant than other based off results. But no, I mean these models I kind of like thought about and picked out through having like a biological like concept behind it. I didn't really want to have like a kitchen sink approach by throwing a bunch of stuff together. I feel like reviewers don't really like that all that much, but
Did you find any kind of multi-collinearity or any issues like that when you have all these variables?
oh, with all the variables that I tested, so there was no strong correlinearity. I think they were all like the Pearson's correlation coefficient value that I got highest was like 0.4 or something.
I think Bobby can go in there.
Yeah, but
Kind of first off, amazing talk, Kevin.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. But kind of piggybacking off of Bryce and Luke, with life history, obviously, it's still pretty poorly understood. But do you think seasonality has an influence on these guys and their movements?
yeah, so there's a paper that looks at seasonality where they kind of monitored, they had video cameras on the burrows and they just monitored the burrows like over the course of a year. And because they hate me, summer's when they're most active. So, and there's also papers that look at eDNA detection, like conducting eDNA surveys when that species is most active is going to give you the best results. Yeah, Cal.
Okay. So Luke mentioned about connectedness between all these of salamanders. I was just wondering if, like, since you did the data collection at a very fine scale or thorough switching stuff like that, did you find any effect of fragmentation in that seed?
No, I didn't really look at it spatially though. And I mean, this site is again like it has high habitat quality to it because it was only like within one ravine. I wouldn't imagine there would be much habitat fragmentation, but that is a really cool question. That would be something really cool to look at. Yeah, John.
I know it's a very fine scale, and you mentioned using like people who use cameras. But has there been anything done with like for the detection issue? Has there been anything done that you know of with like either LiDAR or ultrasound to detect the burrows?
I think they're too small for LiDAR. And I mean like, yeah, I don't know. You would need very small LiDAR and because they're like so flush with the ground, I'm not sure if it would pick them up. Ultrasound would be really cool, but I don't think we have that either. Simon.
I was wondering, like the land ownership of this crosshair range, like how it was owned by, how it's managed, and if there's any way you could see your results, like informing the range.
So with the land management idea, or like with who owns the land, kind of. Yeah, I mean, so kind of one of the thoughts I had is, if you had a site that was a new purchase, right? Well, for one thing, like the microhabitat, like site prioritization, like you were able to use my results to try to prioritize sites based off microhabitat. You could identify lands for purchase that like, this is like optimum habitat, and it's maybe at risk because of who owns the land. Let's when we have this X number of money, let's purchase that. Yeah, more so broadly as well. If you were to have land that's like you're able to do some kind of management there to try to improve the quality, looking at those other factors, making sure before you even go in with like boots on the ground, making sure that the soil isn't too compacted there. Because like if it is, like maybe we don't really have a way of fixing that. Maybe we should divert our effort elsewhere, or maybe there needs to be more exposed rock and somehow incorporate that in as well, or more coarse-weighted debris.
So that's great. But who owns it currently? It's just
Oh.
a patchwork of.
Yeah, it's a patchwork of timber companies. It's gotten a lot better where Alabama, the state of Alabama, has purchased more land in recent years.
Anything online?
That's a good question. I have 17 on red. Okay, so Nilesh asked, are those significant environmental variables particular to red hill salamanders, or are those important to general for salamanders? So a bit of both, Nilesh. Like, so the distance to structure one, for example, I think, oh, actually, I don't know, maybe you could test that with other salamanders as well. But that was one that's like specifically mentioned in some literature where it's like we notice burrows close to rock outcrops. But like things like leaf litter, that's just general salamander stuff. Soil compaction is kind of more general salamander stuff as well. Evan asked, is there anything you thought of that you could change in your methods or anything from sampling methods from other species that can improve the false negatives you got with eDNA? Yeah, I just think like more swabs per burrow is the main thing that I think of. I went and looked at some after I got those results, I went and looked at some papers to see what other, terrestrial eDNA and also aquatic eDNA, like what their false negative rates were. And it varied drastically. There was one that was an aquatic one where they were sampling bromeliad water, so it had like a specific target site, kind of like ours did, and their false negative rate was like really, really low. But that was also aquatic. And then there was like others, there was an indigo snake one, and that's also a somewhat specific target site because it's like the mouth of a gopher tortoise burrow. They also tested drift fences, so they had cameras to know to like compare it to, and their false negative rate, I can't remember, was like I think around ours. I think it was also in the 30s, but yeah, that's it.
Thanks again, everybody, for being here. Thanks for your great questions. Please help me